This is the first video of section 5, which is all about vCenter. This video is about what vCenter is and how we can go about installing and configuring it. In this video, we're going to talk about vCenter, which is really what makes ESXi into vSphere, is the management server that allows us to do a lot of the advanced functionality that people think of when they think of vSphere or the VMware platform. So we'll talk about the relationship between the platform services controller and vCenter server or servers. We'll also talk a little bit about the database requirements and the different deployment models you can consider, and also what kind of hardware you should plan for a vCenter environment. If it's a physical server, I guess you'll probably have more than enough resources, but a virtual vCenter, which is definitely possible, we'll think about how we might want to size that. So ESXi, together with the vCenter management infrastructure, provides us what we call vSphere. So vCenter allows us to take multiple ESXi hosts and make them into clusters and data centers. I mean, a data center is really just an object that I can store permissions and things against, but a cluster allows us to do high availability and distributed resource management features, which is really what people typically think of when they think of, the full capability of vSphere is features like vMotion and storage vMotion and high availability and fault tolerance and the distributed resource scheduler and distributed power management and all these other kinds of features. There's a lot of things that ESXi can do on its own, but to be able to really operate a data center rather than a server, then it takes vCenter to do that. So this is where, of course, you're going to have to start paying, but ESXi as a free solution is very, very good, but has, of course, its serious limitations. And with vCenter, we can install it either as a Windows or as a Linux appliance version. So we can install the Windows version on either a physical machine or a virtual machine. And the appliance version, which is based on SUSE Linux, is a virtual machine. It's an OVA that we can deploy into the environment. So in addition to vCenter, as vSphere environments got larger and larger and larger, it was recognized that having all of the vCenter or all of the management related functions on one system that's highly dependent on Windows and Active Directory was not necessarily the image that VMware wanted to present to the world. So over the last few versions, they've really been increasing the amount of infrastructure that goes along with vCenter to start doing some of the functions that Active Directory was providing to vCenter traditionally, things like Kerberos logons. Previously, you could separate the database and the inventory services and the single sign-on services and the vCenter services onto all kinds of different servers. Now, all of the non-vCenter related services, so licensing, single sign-on, the certificate authority that's used for the default security installation of vCenter, all of that is based on something now called the Platform Services Controller. So you can't separate the inventory service from the single sign-on service anymore, but really, why would you really need to do that? For more details on all that, take a look at this VMware KB article 211-3115, and it goes into a lot more of what the Platform Services Controller is really all about and some of the different deployment considerations you might have to make. But generally speaking, you've got two choices. You can do what's called the embedded deployment model, where we have the vCenter and the Platform Services Controller installed on a single server, physical or virtual, or the external deployment model where we install them separately. So we have a dedicated Platform Services Controller and one or more dedicated vCenter servers. Well, one or more dedicated Platform Services Controllers and one or more dedicated vCenter servers. You used to be able to run the inventory service and the single sign-on service on a vCenter server and then add other additional vCenter servers that used it. You can do this, but it actually is not supported and you should not. So you really, if you're going to be using more than one vCenter server, then you have to run a dedicated Platform Services Controller. And again, I would say run two. So once again, there's some VMware KB articles. If you're going to be doing a larger environment, take a look at KB 210-8548 and 210-7948 for more of the details on these different deployment models and how you might support, for example, a multi-site environment using multiple vCenter servers and multiple platform controllers. So when it comes to vCenter itself, especially if you're going to run it in a VM, then we have some sizing choices that we need to make. Effectively, the Platform Services Controller functions take up 2 CPUs and 2 gigs of memory. So that's your baseline if you're going to run them together. Then, depending on the size of your environment, you'll need more or less CPU and memory. So for a tiny environment, 10 hosts, 100 virtual machines, they recommend 2 CPUs with 8 gigs of RAM And as you can see, it scales all the way up to the max, which is 1,000 hosts with 10,000 VMs. Will require 16 CPUs and 32 gigs of RAM. And if you did that on the unified embedded deployment model, then you'd need to add 2 CPUs and 2 gigs of RAM to that. So you'd be at what, 18 CPUs and 34 gigs of RAM. And I would take these numbers with a grain of salt anyway. I would not run 10 hosts with 8 gigs of RAM for my vCenter and platform services controller. So like all vendor memory recommendations, we should probably double them. And if you've got the budget, then double them again. You're certainly not going to harm the system by adding more memory to it than it needs, but you may definitely see performance issues with not necessarily VM operations, but VM management operations will start to potentially be very, very slow. Things like logons and so on to vCenter may be very slow, where your virtual machines are actually fairly happy. So in addition to sizing the server, we're also going to have to plan for the database, where the various events and performance and historical data from the virtual machines and the servers are going to get collected and stored. So if you're running vCenter on Windows, you have the choice of either SQL Server or the Postgres embedded database. So previously this used to use SQL Server Express, which is the free version of SQL Server, but had a lot of issues with database grooming jobs because the SQL Express doesn't include something called the SQL agent. So the new Postgres database has no cleanup issues, but still there's some limitations. So they recommend Postgres for Windows only up to about 20 hosts and 200 VMs. If you're going to run the vCenter appliance, an appliance kind of implies you could push a button and it magically works, which is not really the case in the case of the vCenter appliance. It does require you to do a fair amount of Linux, so I wouldn't think of it as a cheap solution, and it's certainly not an easy solution, but it does definitely reduce your dependency on Microsoft, and especially if you don't have an infrastructure that's designed to manage Windows systems. So the appliance now does have better scalability than it used to. It does use Postgres, but you can do up to 100 hosts and 3,000 VMs. But that's not the limit, right? vCenter effectively, a vCenter environment, you can get it up to about, 1,000 hosts with 10,000 VMs. Getting to that point is going to require you to either run full-scale SQL Server on Windows or Oracle potentially not on the appliance, but on a dedicated server that the appliance connects to. And I would say also for our SQL Server too, we would probably not run it on the Windows vCenter, but the Windows vCenter is the only one that can use SQL Server. So we'll take a look in the demo at installing vCenter. For Windows in this case, it's fairly straightforward. Once you have vCenter installed, there's really very little difference between the Windows and the Linux version, but getting the Linux version installed can definitely take a lot more work, particularly when it comes to things like SSL certificates and so on. So we'll take a look at the Windows version in this course anyway. Now that we've seen how to manage a single ESXi host with the vSphere desktop client or using the new HTML5 web interface, we probably at some point are going to want to have multiple servers that we don't need to connect to by running multiple copies of the client, and we're probably going to want to use a lot of the features that vCenter enables for us, unless you're running on the free ESXi. So there are quite a few features that require vCenter to run, like HA and fault tolerance and DRS and vMotion, and really just about anything that involves 2 ESXi boxes, we're going to need to have vCenter to do something with it. So I'm just going to go ahead and click the install link and then confirm that I want to launch it. Okay, so now that it's finished initializing, I can just go ahead and click next to get the installation going. So in this case, we've got yet another end user license agreement, which I'll review carefully and then agree to completely. And then just click next. And you can see I've got the option now to install vCenter along with a platform services controller, or I can install the platform services controller on its own and then register other vCenters with it later. And if I run a very large environment, I might need to do that. But for my purposes, I'm just going to go ahead and install vCenter and the platform services controller together. And you can see that it wants to know the fully qualified system name for my system, which in this case is fine if I had multiple names or if I was connected to a bunch of different networks, and if I had several DNS suffixes configured or something along those lines, I might need to. So you can see that the platform services controller still contains the single sign-on components that I was talking about from vSphere 5, but they're embedded into the platform services controller. So what we're going to have is a user called administrator@vsphere.local if I keep that as my domain name. And a lot of people keep that at the defaults for vsphere.local, and that's fine. If I'd already set this up somewhere else through another, dedicated platform services controller, then I could join a single sign-on domain that already exists. In this case, I'm going to create one. Now, for the local installation of the service on Windows, it needs a service account, or it can use the local system account, which is not really the best option and is really not a best practice. You should really run this using a domain user account that's got rather low privileges. Although for my lab environment, it's okay. I'll just go ahead with the local system. Now, for the database settings, you can see I have the option to use vPostgres or to use an external database. In earlier versions of VMware, you would have the option to use SQL Express, which really is still an option, but you would need to install SQL Express and configure it rather than having the installer do it for you. Once you've got SQL Server or Oracle or DB2 or any of the supported database platforms, I think at this time those are the supported database platforms, then you could go and, well, I suppose Postgres, you could go and configure an ODBC connection to it and then provide those details here. But I'm not going to do that. I'll just install vPostgres. I don't need to change any of the default ports, so I'm just going to leave those as is and hit next. But as you can see, there are quite a lot of services that make up vCenter and provide all the communication, security functions, and other functions of the system. I don't really need to, in this case, change the install paths, although again, it might be a good idea to put those somewhere other than my operating system drive, but I'm just going to go ahead and finish up the installation. Once the installation is finished, we get a confirmation screen saying that everything's successfully installed, and you see I have a link to the vSphere web client, but I'm not going to bother launching that for now. I'm just going to go ahead and close this installation, and we'll take a look at that other stuff in a later video. So in summary, for simple deployments, you can just create a virtual machine that runs vCenter and the platform services controller, and that's totally okay. And if your needs grow to the point that that doesn't meet your needs anymore, then you can just migrate out to a new model. And it's fairly easy anyway. Even if you had to do vCenter from scratch, it's fairly easy if you don't get too far down the road with it to just re-add hosts to a new vCenter anyway. So not necessarily the end of the world, but there is a migration model from one model to the other, from the single host to the external model. But for the multi-vCenter server environments that you might see in a larger environment, you will need to use a dedicated platform controller, and you should really probably use 2 or more. And again, if you're Linux friendly, then you should definitely consider the vCenter appliance. It works well, it's fully supported, and it fully supports the capabilities of vSphere. And can hit the maximum limits. Whereas up until recently, to get to the max scalability limits, you actually had to be running the Windows vCenter, but that's really not the case anymore. So now that we have our initial installation of the Platform Services Controller and vCenter completed, we can then go on to configure single sign-on with Active Directory or other identity sources that we want to integrate with. So let's take a look at that in the next video.